Rusted iron bit deep into my flesh, but I kept my hands perfectly still. Hot blood slicked the heavy metal cuffs around my wrists. Above me, 70 lords loomed behind the mahogany bench. The stagnant air choked on the smell of nervous sweat and sour wine. They wanted my head on a spike. I carried no magic in my veins, and I possessed no wolf. My weapon was black ink. I held the high judge's stare, letting the silence stretch out. My numbers had just drained their empire dry. A deafening crack shattered the hall. The massive oak doors ruptured inward. Splintered wood rained across the cold marble floor as a towering shadow eclipsed the midday sun. The sharp bite of winter pine and ozone flooded the room, cutting straight through the stench of the lords. Fenrir ignored the screaming merchants. He ignored the guards scrambling for their weapons. His golden gaze locked directly onto my torn wrists. The sovereign stepped over the ruined timber. The ringing in my ears slowly faded, giving way to a sudden, terrifying quiet. Dust drifted through the shafts of broken light. A thick vein pulsed at his temple. Unlock her chains. The command was soft, freezing steel. Or I burn this city to ash. Chapter 1. The iron collar hit the polished marble. The sharp crack cut through the dining hall. For a single ringing second, the stifling heat seemed to vanish. Tahlia jerked back, the smell of roasted meat mixed with spilled wine and cheap perfume. It made her stomach turn. Her uncle lounged in his high chair. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the collar. Put it on the tithe mutt. He took a slow sip of his wine. She is a small payment for such a large misunderstanding, apex sovereign. Ice settled against her ribs. A small payment. Her blood was buying his pardon. 2 guards grabbed her. They didn't hesitate. The blue clan silk tore straight down the center, and cold air bit her bare skin. They shoved a rough wool sack over her head. Dust filled her lungs. She coughed, the sound muffled by the thick fabric. She dragged her gaze across the long oak table. Fenrir sat in the shadows. Silver scars lined his jaw, and his gold eyes were already locked onto hers. He hadn't touched his plate. His massive frame was perfectly still. Her mother's old stories bled into her mind. The winter storms did not eat the weak. They simply let the frost claim them. Her uncle leaned forward. He was waiting. He wanted the tears. He wanted her knees hitting the stone. Tahlia tipped her chin upward. She stared at the northern warlord, clamped her jaw shut, and swallowed the metallic taste of fear. The silence stretched. The only sound was the rain beating against the high glass windows. Fenrir stood. Wood grated against stone, and the room froze. He walked around the table, his heavy boots hitting the floorboards, with a steady, even rhythm. He stopped. He was so close she could smell the cold mountain pine on his clothes. He looked down at the iron ring on the table. His boots snapped out. Metal shattered against the far stone wall. She walks unbound. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Or I burn this house to ash. He turned away. The sharp tang of crushed iron hung in the air. He stopped, looking back over his shoulder. Walk, little bird. The heat of the banquet was gone. Up in her attic prison, frost crawled across the pitch-black walls. Tahlia dropped to the floorboards. Dust coated her throat. She found the loose plank and dug her nails under the edge. Splinters caught her skin. She pulled. The wood gave way. She bit the inside of her cheek, tasting copper. Her fingers found the cold, heavy leather, the master ledger. She pulled it out and pressed it against her chest. 10 years of fake numbers, hidden bribes, and stolen silver lived inside these pages. The ink was proof of her uncle's treason. She shoved the book deep into the pocket of her wool dress. The leather felt like a block of ice against her ribs. The door kicked open. A lowland guard stepped into the room. Yellow torchlight threw long shadows across the low ceiling. He grabbed her cloth bag from the cot and tipped it upside down. A wooden comb and a pair of grey socks hit the floor. "Looking for stolen silver, tithe mutt." He kicked the comb across the room. It clattered against the far wall. "Your uncle said you might try to take something." Tahlia planted her feet. She took a slow, shallow breath. Her arm rested naturally at her side, inches from the hidden ledger. Let him try to search her. She would fight until her hands broke. He stared at her for a long second. The torch crackled in the damp air. He threw the empty sack at her chest. "Move. The storm rides out." Tahlia caught the rough fabric. She didn't look back at the cage. She walked down the dark stairwell, the ledger thumping against her leg with every step. She paused at the bottom. Her fingers brushed the outline of the book through the wall. Let the storm come.
Dawn offered no warmth. The march through the thawing lowlands dragged on for hours. Fenrir sat on his black destrier. The wind tore at his fur cloak. Mud sucked at the boots of the lowland guards as they dragged the iron cargo carts toward the winter border. The stench of rotting leaves and sour water hung thick in the air. A loud crack echoed through the trees. Splintering wood. The prison carriage pitched hard to the left. The iron door blew open, and Tahlia fell out. She hit the freezing black sludge. Fenrir pulled back on his reins. The leather creaked in his grip. He watched her from the saddle. "Get up, tithe mutt." A lowland guard raised a thick leather strap. "You are slowing the march." Fenrir's jaw locked. He waited. He knew how humans acted. They begged. They wept in the dirt. Tahlia didn't make a sound. She pushed herself up. Black mud coated her raw hands. She didn't look at the guard, and she didn't flinch at the raised strap. She walked straight to the broken wheel and stared at the splintered axle. The wind howled through the bare branches. "The load is unbalanced." She spoke over the wind. "You have 300 pounds of iron ore stacked on the left. The axle cannot hold the tension." She pointed a mud-caked finger at the cart. "Move the iron to the back right. Brace the split wood with the spare iron rod and wrap it with wet leather. It will freeze solid in 10 minutes and hold the weight." The lowland guard stared at her. Nobody moved. Fenrir shifted in his saddle. She had no weapons. She had no magic. She stood shivering in the sludge, and she commanded the ground beneath her feet. He kicked his horse forward. Once the massive animal closed the distance, stopping mere inches from her shoulder. The guard scrambled backward into the mud. Tahlia tilted her head back to look up at him. He didn't ask permission. He reached down, his scarred fist grabbing the thick wool at the back of her dress. He hoisted her up and dropped her across the pommel of his saddle. She gasped. Her back hit his chest armor. "Hold on." He snapped the heavy reins. The horse lunged forward, leaving the broken cart and the staring guards behind in the snow. Fenrir wrapped his arm around her waist. He pulled her freezing body tight against him. The steady thud of the horse's hooves masked the silence between them. He leaned his head down, speaking right against her ear. "Mine to wield."
The agonizing ascent ended. High iron gates loomed out of the snow, casting a long shadow over the mountain pass. They slammed shut. The metallic boom rattled Tahlia's teeth. Her fingers were completely numb. The black destrier stomped to a brutal halt in the courtyard. Wind whipped ice crystals against her face, and the smell of bitter wood smoke hit the back of her throat. Leather creaked. Fenrir's heavy hands gripped her waist. He lifted her and dropped her over the side of the saddle. Her bare feet hit the ice-slicked stone. Pain splintered up her shins. She caught her breath. Silence dropped over the yard like a falling axe. Hundreds of towering warriors formed a massive ring around the courtyard. They stared at her. Their faces were hollowed out, feral. A silver-haired woman stepped from the ranks. She walked to a wooden wagon and threw a single burlap sack onto the frost. The matriarch shoved her hand inside the bag. She pulled out a fistful of dust and gravel. She spat on the frozen stone inches from Tahlia's toes. "Is this lowland? Wealth?" The woman's voice cracked like a whip in the freezing air. "We trade our peace for a useless tithe mutt." Tahlia looked at the burlap. She knew that knot. It was a cheap lowland merchant tie. That sack held rations for 10 men, at most. Hundreds of massive fighters surrounded her in this yard. They are starving. She stared at the dust on the ice. Her uncle was strangling the northern supply lines. Why? A heavy vibration shook the stone, breaking the tension. Fenrir didn't even look at the matriarch. "Take her to the lower kitchens." His voice was absolute iron. "She is not to be touched, but she works for her keep." He turned his back. His heavy boots crunched against the frost as he walked toward the high keep. He had thrown her into a pit of starving killers, but he had also drawn a line of blood around her neck. Tahlia grabbed the thin wool of her skirt. She stepped out of the wind and walked directly into the pitch-black kitchen doors. The brutal wind of the courtyard vanished. Down in the subterranean vaults, the air was dead. It smelled of wet earth and rotting potatoes. Tahlia rubbed her goosebump-covered arms. The stone walls seemed to press inward. A single torch spat oil against the brick. She knelt on the dirt floor, counting the shriveled roots in a wooden bin. Dust coated a stack of slates resting on a split barrel nearby. She picked up the top one. Rough wood scraped her frozen fingers. Messy white chalk listed the fortress inventory. 300 sacks of flour, 50 barrels of salted meat, 200 crates of winter apples. Tahlia looked around the vault. The shelves were completely bare. There was no meat on the iron hooks. The chalk was a lie. She dug into her pocket and pulled out the stolen ledger. The leather felt like a block of ice against her palm. She flipped back to the previous month. Her uncle's neat ink sat right there on the page. A massive, completed payment from the mountain for these exact crates. The cargo had never reached the snow line. The quartermaster was forging the chalk. He was verifying the deliveries and selling the food right back to the lowland guilds for gold, bleeding his own people dry for copper coins. Heat flared in her chest. Her uncle's merchants drank sweet wine, while this winter fortress chewed on rocks. A massive shadow blocked the torchlight. "You read very well for a tithe mutt." Tahlia spun around. A heavy-set man filled the stone archway. A blood-stained leather apron stretched tight across his gut. His right hand twitched. A long, curved skinning knife caught the orange flame. His heavy boot scraped the stone. He stepped into the vault and pointed the steel blade right at her throat.
Night fell. The quiet damp of the vaults gave way to the noise of the great hall. Smoke choked the black rafters. The air smelled of unwashed bodies and rising violence. Fenrir sat at the high table. He rested his scarred jaw against his fist, his eyes tracking the room. His people were hungry. They were on edge. They needed a target. The heavy oak kitchen doors groaned open. Tahlia walked into the firelight. She carried a massive wooden tray loaded with boiling, thin broth. Her tiny frame wove through the towering ranks of warriors. Soot stained her tattered dress. She didn't look down or hug the walls. She walked straight down the center aisle. Fenrir narrowed his eyes. The heavy-set quartermaster shadowed her steps. The man's eyes darted around the hall. He was sweating. The quartermaster lunged. He slammed two thick hands into Tahlia's spine. She pitched forward. The wooden tray flew from her grip. Boiling, greasy liquid exploded across her chest. Clay bowls shattered against the stone floor. The roaring hall went dead silent. "Watch your feet, you clumsy spy." The quartermaster jammed a thick finger at her face. "She's trying to ruin what little food we have left." The wolf beneath Fenrir's skin clawed at his ribs. His knuckles turned white. He gripped the edge of the high table until the solid oak splintered in his hand. He wanted to tear the man's throat out. He clamped his jaws shut. He forced his muscles to stay perfectly still. Let's see what she does. Tahlia locked her knees. She stood up. Scalding broth dripped from her chin. It soaked through her wool dress, blistering the bare skin of her collarbone. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't even wipe the burning grease from her face. She simply turned her head. She locked her eyes on the quartermaster. It was the dead, unblinking stare of an executioner. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Fenrir saw the lethal promise burning in her eyes. She had the ledger. She held the blade. The smell of scorched wool and rendered fat hit Fenrir's nose. Tahlia's ragged breaths echoed in the silent hall. Fenrir leaned back against his carved chair. A dark smirk curved the corner of his scarred mouth. Beta. His voice was a low rumble, meant only for the warrior beside him. Go to the lower vaults. Fenrir kept his eyes on the girl. Bring me the quartermaster's inventory slates, all of them.
The fortress slept. Midnight brought a bitter frost to the stone corridors. Tahlia kept to the shadows. Her tattered skirt brushed silently against the walls as she crept toward the heavy oak doors of the sovereign's war room. A sliver of moonlight cut through the crack. The air inside smelled of old parchment and dried blood. She pressed her bare palm flat against the wood and pushed. The hinges scraped a low warning. She slipped inside. A massive table sat in the center of the room. Thick, curling maps covered every inch of the wood. The mountain was bleeding out, and the knife was hidden somewhere in these lines. Tahlia stepped closer. Her eyes tracked the thick black charcoal roots drawn across the paper. Her chest tightened. The quartermaster wasn't just stealing grain. He was routing the northern hunting parties straight through the lowland trade blockades. He was sending their best fighters directly into a slaughterhouse. A sick memory surfaced. A fat lowland merchant tossing poisoned bread to starving street dogs. The northern pack was walking blindly toward the butcher. She grabbed a piece of jagged charcoal from the edge of the table. Black dust coated her fingers. She slashed a hard X directly over the quartermaster's hunting routes. Then she dragged a heavy line around the eastern ridge. It was a forgotten goat path, a secret passage she'd memorized from her uncle's private ledgers. It bypassed the lowland steel completely. They could collar her neck, but they could not collar her mind. She held a perfect map of the continent locked behind her eyes. So a low rumble tore through the dead silence of the room. Tahlia froze. Her boots stayed planted on the stone. The charcoal snapped in her grip, crumbling into dust. A massive shape separated from the pitch-black corner. Fenrir. He had been standing in the dark the entire time. "You bleed my maps." His voice was a gravelly whisper.
Fenrir stepped into the pale moonlight. The sharp scent of crushed winter berries hit the air. Her fear. Yet she didn't run. She stood right beside his war table, her small fingers stained black with dust. He crossed the room without a sound. He stopped beside her, looming over the parchment. He traced a leather-clad finger over the bold new route she had just drawn. His jaw tightened. She had just broken a tactical deadlock his best generals had been bleeding over for 6 months. The Eastern Ridge. It was terrifyingly brilliant. The wolf in his chest thrashed. It wanted to claim the feral, human girl who dared to overwrite a warlord in his own sanctum. He shoved the instinct down. A sovereign couldn't be ruled by wild blood. He needed her mind more than he needed his pride. He walked around the heavy oak table. He stopped inches from her face. She was small, and the mountain was brutal. His hand dropped to his thick leather belt, iron ground against iron. He unhooked the master ring, a dozen massive, ancient keys that opened the vaults, the gates, and the high armory. He tossed the ring onto the map. The metal crashed against the wood, pinning her newly drawn lines. Audit the mountain. He leaned down. The heat radiating off his skin met the freezing air between them. You have until dawn.
Dawn broke. The quiet isolation of the war room was gone. Blinding morning sun hit the icy courtyard. Tahlia marched through knee-deep snow. The iron master keys clanked against her frozen thigh with every step. She had spent the entire night down in the deep vaults, counting barrels, counting crates. The pack had exactly 4 days before starvation claimed them. A shadow fell across her path. The silver-haired matriarch stood in the snow. 2 massive guards flanked her. "Where did you steal those, tithe mutt?" The matriarch's hand cracked through the air. The back of her knuckles slammed into Tahlia's wrist. The heavy iron ring ripped from Tahlia's numb fingers and vanished into a deep snowbank. A human cannot hold the iron of the mountain. The matriarch's voice echoed off the high walls. "You are dirt. You are a spy." Tahlia stood her ground. The wind bit through her thin dress, but a furnace roared in her chest. Across the courtyard, the sharp clash of sparring steel stopped. Fenrir stood shirtless in the snow. He lowered his weapons. He wiped sweat from his chest, his eyes locked on the spot where the keys had fallen. He watched the matriarch step into Tahlia's face. He didn't move to intervene. He was watching, waiting. Tahlia dropped to her knees in the powder. She ignored the older woman completely. She kept her eyes pinned entirely on the warlord across the yard. Her blue fingers dug into the ice. She found the freezing iron ring and wrapped her fist around it. She stood up. She brushed the snow from her skirt. Then she turned her stare onto the matriarch. "The mountain is starving." She didn't yell, but the words carried like a gunshot in the cold air. "The quartermaster is trading our grain for lowland gold. Your guards failed to check his ledgers. You are blind." The matriarch bared her teeth. Tahlia took a step forward, invading the older woman's space. "As the acting auditor of this keep, I order the immediate stop of all meat rations to the matriarch's personal guard. It will not resume until the missing inventory is recovered." The courtyard went completely silent. Dozens of towering warriors stared at the human girl who had just starved their elite guard with a single sentence. Across the blood-stained snow, a slow smile carved its way across Fenrir's scarred face. Checkmate. Late afternoon shadows stretched across the frozen courtyard. Heavy iron hinges shrieked. 3 massive wooden wagons breached the perimeter, dragged by lathered, exhausted horses. Tahlia stopped dead. Bitter copper flooded the back of her throat. Her eyes locked onto the lead wagon. A heavy parchment manifest was nailed to the splintered oak. Crimson wax bled down the center, stamped with a familiar crest. Her uncle's seal. The man starving this mountain didn't send gifts. The quartermaster shoved past the perimeter guards. His greasy fingers twitched against his leather apron. A feverish yellow gleam in his eyes. "Unload it." He pointed at the men. "Straight to the lower vaults." Tahlia threw her weight forward, planting herself directly in his path. "Stop." The heavy man loomed over her. "Get out of my way, tithe mutt." "The lowlands sent a peace offering." Tahlia ignored him. She stepped to the wagon and plunged her bare hands into the first open burlap sack. Plump, golden grain slid through her fingers. The air smelled of wet wood and horse sweat, but beneath that was a sickly, sweet undertone. Crushed purple petals. A memory bled into the freezing courtyard. Her uncle smiling over a jeweled chalice, while a rival merchant choked to death on the floor. A starving northern guard rushed forward. He plunged his fist into the open sack, dragging a handful of raw grain toward his cracked lips. "No!" Tahlia slapped his hand hard. golden kernels scattered across the frozen mud. The guard's jaw dropped. His amber eyes flared with sudden, violent intent. Tahlia held her ground. She pulled a silver pin from her messy braid. As she picked up a single crushed kernel from the mud and drove the sharp metal directly into the center of it. The silver tip oxidized instantly. It turned a venomous, absolute black. The breath vanished from the courtyard. She dropped the black and silver onto the snow. Nightshade! She didn't raise her voice. This is a mass execution. She ripped the crimson-sealed manifest from the oak planks and turned toward the high keep. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her grip on the paper was steady. She was ready to draw blood.
The panic from the courtyard poured into the great hall. Hundreds of warriors packed the cavernous room for an emergency tribunal. Iron torches spat orange sparks against the black stone, filling the drafty air with a smell of sour sweat and burning pine. Fenrir sat on the high throne. His jaw was locked tight. The quartermaster knelt on the stone floor, pinned by two towering sentinels. Saliva flew from the man's mouth. She poisoned the grain herself. A low, dangerous rumble rolled through the older elders in the room. Tahlia stepped into the circle of firelight. Massive warriors towered over her on all sides, but she didn't shrink. She held the heavy leather ledger flat against her palms. Her spine was a column of steel. A dark possessiveness clawed up Fenrir's throat. He leaned forward, gripping the carved armrests. It was the fourth day of the harvest moon. Tahlia's voice dropped like an anvil. You accepted 400 silver coins from the trade guild. You hid the copper in the false bottom of the third wine barrel. The blood drained from the quartermaster's face. Thick parchment snapped as Tahlia turned the page. On the 10th day, you sold 80 crates of salted meat to the lowlands. You recorded them as spoiled by rot. She wielded the numbers like a hunting knife. The heavy man thrashed wildly against the guards, holding his arms. Do not listen to her. Fenrir stood up. Wood scraped violently against stone. The great hall went dead silent. He walked down the dais, his heavy boots devouring the distance, until he stopped right beside Tahlia. The heat of her small, defiant frame radiated against his side. He looked down at the trembling traitor. A scarred hand shot forward. His thick fingers locked around the quartermaster's throat. Fenrir hoisted the heavy man entirely off the floor. He didn't speak. Treason only had one currency. His golden eyes slid sideways, resting on his quiet, brilliant human. Then, with a violent twist of his wrist, he executed the sentence. The wet snap of vertebrae echoed off the high rafters. The traitor's frantic gasps stopped instantly. Fenrir dropped the lifeless body onto the stone. He turned his stare over the paralyzed hall, then stepped over the corpse and leaned close to Tahlia's ear. Your ledger is law.
The long night finally broke into a bruised dawn. Tahlia stood alone on the high battlements. The stone balcony jutted out over a black, frozen abyss. Bitter wind bit at her bare arms. She dug her fingernails into her skin. A man was dead because of her ink. He had starved his own people for copper coins, but the wet crack of his spine still echoed in her head. Heavy footfalls crunched against the frost behind her. Tahlia kept her back straight. The scent of sharp pine and dark leather filled the air as Fenrir stopped inches behind her. The furnace-like heat of his massive body blocked the freezing wind. Metal clasps clinked. He stripped the heavy, black-furred mantle from his own shoulders. He dropped the massive pelt over her trembling back. The suffocating warmth swallowed her frame. It was the undeniable weight of the apex sovereign. Oh, a wordless vow. She tilted her chin up toward the bruised sky. He watched her, his unblinking eyes tracking the steady rise and fall of her chest. You saved my lines. His voice was a low rumble. You bleed for us. Why? Because starvation was a cage she knew too well. A brutal blast shattered the quiet dawn. A war horn echoed through the valley below. A second blast answered. Then a third. Tahlia lunged for the icy edge of the balcony. Black steel bled out from the distant tree line. Thousands of lowland foot soldiers marched through the white powder, their spiked shields locked into formation. Above the marching iron, crimson banners snapped in the wind. Her uncle's crest. The poisoned grain had never been a peace offering. It was a distraction. Tahlia gripped the stone rail until her knuckles turned white. See, he brought the slaughter to our gates. The war horn dragged the entire fortress to the great hall by midday. Heavy oak doors ruptured inward. Blinding sun cut through the dark stone shadows. Tahlia pressed her back against the freezing wall, locking her knees to keep from shaking. Her uncle walked into the room. A dozen lowland mercenaries in heavy steel followed him. He wore immaculate emerald velvet. The drafty air suddenly choked on his sickeningly sweet cologne. Beneath the heavy perfume was the unmistakable smell of rot. Hundreds of scarred warriors bared their teeth. A low rumble vibrated through the floorboards. The lowlander didn't flinch. Sovereign Fenrir. His voice echoed in the high rafters. We come under the white flag of the Trade Guild. To offer peace. His pale eyes dragged through the torch-lit shadows. They locked onto Tahlia. His lip curled. He took in the soot on her skin and the tattered edges of her dress. He looked at her like dirt on the bottom of his shoe. I see my stray mutt still breathes. He didn't look away from her. Send her to the kitchens. We are men of steel and coin. She is a distraction. 10 years of a conditioned terror grabbed Tahlia by the throat. Her ruined shoes scraped backward against the stone. She remembered a trapped fox in the winter woods, chewing off its own leg to escape a snare. She needed the dark. She needed to hide. Crack. A massive hand slammed onto the oak table. The deafening sound killed the noise in the hall instantly. Fenrir rose from his throne. He didn't spare a glance for the mercenaries. He ignored the velvet-clad lord entirely. His golden eyes were fixed solely on Tahlia. He reached over and grabbed the back of a heavy, fur-lined chair. Wood shrieked against stone as he dragged it across the dais. He slammed it down directly beside his own throne, the right hand, the seat of blood-sworn honor. He pointed a thick, scarred finger at the empty fur. Sit. The single word rang out, commanding the oxygen in the room. He was staking her worth in front of the man who had starved her. The terror in Tahlia's gut turned to ash. A new sharp heat took its place. She didn't cry. She didn't step back into the shadows. She walked straight up the dais. She grabbed the dark fur and sat down beside the warlord. She stared dead into her uncle's eyes. Show us the ink.
The lowlander's mouth fell open. A human girl sat at the right hand of the sovereign. Fenrir crossed his arms over his chest. The steel plates of his bracers clinked together. His eyes tracked a frantic, pulsing vein in the lowlander's thick neck. He wanted to vault the table. He wanted to tear the man's throat out with his teeth. He ground his molars together until his jaw ached, forcing his muscles to stay still. Her uncle fumbled with a silver tube. He pulled out a thick roll of parchment and threw it onto the scarred wood. It landed exactly between Fenrir and Tahlia. This is a legal decree from the High Council. The man rubbed his sweating palms on his velvet thighs. You northern savages broke the treaty. Your hunting parties raided 3 of our supply caravans last month. Fenrir gripped his own forearms, and they fought with paper and coward's gold. His pack hadn't raided a single cart. The guild just wanted his iron, and they were building a cage of lies to take it. The penalty is absolute. A jeweled finger tapped the paper. Surrender half of your mineral rights today. Refuse, and my 10,000 mercenaries waiting in the valley will slaughter your pack. Legally. The reality of a dying winter pressed down on Fenrir. He was boxed into a corner. A small hand reached across the oak. Tahlia pulled the heavy treaty toward her chest. She ignored her uncle completely. Her eyes scanned the text, eventually locking onto the bright crimson wax seal at the bottom of the page. The great hall was completely still. The only sound was the hiss of the torches. She ran a fingernail over a microscopic stamp buried deep in the wax. She tilted her head, and her shoulder brushed against Fenrir's arm. This wax. She didn't look up from the page. It was stamped 3 months before the caravans ever left the capital.
The tribunal ended. The tension spilled out into the biting wind of the courtyard. The lowlanders set up an arrogant perimeter just outside the open iron gates. Her uncle broke away from his guards and marched straight into Tahlia's path. His face was flushed red. He pulled a heavy leather pouch from his belt and threw it at her feet. The bag ruptured against the ice. Bright gold coins exploded across the snow. "Buy yourself a headstone." Spit flew from his lips. "When my steel takes this keep at dawn, you burn with the rest of these savages. You are dirt." A month ago, she would have dropped to her knees and scrambled for the coins. But that girl was dead. She held the truth bound in hidden leather, and she held a seat at the Warlord's table. Tahlia stood tall. Fenrir's heavy pelt rested on her shoulders, a dense and grounding weight against the wind. She stepped forward. She placed her soot-stained shoe directly onto the brightest gold coin and ground it deep into the freezing mud. "Keep your coin." She looked at him with dead eyes. "You'll need it to buy your own coffin." The veins in the man's neck bulged. He spun around and stormed back to his waiting mercenaries. Tahlia didn't waste a second. She turned and ran. She sprinted up the winding stone stairs to the high rookery. The air thinned. The cold bit at her lungs. She pulled a tightly rolled slip of parchment from her pocket. It was a financial cipher, designed for exactly one set of eyes in the capital. She tied the paper to the leather band on a massive black raven's leg. She stepped to the window and launched the bird into the freezing crosswinds. Her bare hands gripped the icy stone ledge. She watched the black wings cut through the grey sky. A smile finally curved her lips. "Bleed them dry."
Night broke into a bleak, freezing dawn. From the high battlements, the full scale of the nightmare was laid bare. The stench of unwashed bodies and oiled steel drifted up the mountainside. Fenrir stood at the edge of the highest stone wall. He raised a heavy, brass-bound spyglass to his eye. He stopped breathing. Polished steel swallowed the valley floor. 10,000 mercenaries packed the snow line. Cruel pikes, iron-banded shields, crimson banners bearing the trade guild crest snapped violently in the wind. The mountain was caged. The arithmetic of survival was 0. A small detachment broke from the vanguard. They spurred their war horses up the steep switchbacks toward the main gates. A rider in emerald velvet led the climb. A white flag whipped from a long ash pole. The uncle. Fenrir lowered the spyglass. His fingers dug into the stone parapet until the ancient rock cracked under his grip. The wind howled through the high peaks. "Sovereign Fenrir!" The man's voice carried up the cliffside. "My steel is hungry. My vanguard is restless." A low growl rattled in Fenrir's chest. "Hand over the mutt." The velvet-clad lord laughed. The sound was thin and cruel. "Surrender the girl, and I spare your savages. Keep her, and my men will slaughter every living soul inside those walls." Down in the courtyard, the ultimatum echoed off the stone. The pack was cornered. Hundreds of eyes looked up at the high wall, waiting for their warlord to make the call. Fenrir's jaw locked tight. Let the mountain burn. Fenrir took the stone stairs down to the courtyard. Panic had already set in. His heavy boots hit the packed earth of the yard. Massive oak beams barricaded the main iron gates, but ancient wood wouldn't hold back an army. The silver-haired matriarch shoved her way to the front of the crowd. She dropped to her knees in the freezing mud. "Sovereign." She looked up, desperate. "You heard him. We must surrender the human. We cannot fight 10,000 swords." Fenrir stared at her. Disgust curled his lip. He looked past the kneeling woman, scanning the chaotic yard. He found the tiny silhouette wrapped in his black furred mantle. Tahlia stood perfectly still near the armory doors. She watched him. She had stopped the poisoned grain. She had used her brilliant mind to save a pack that treated her like dirt. The wolf inside him clawed at his ribs, demanding blood from anyone who threatened her. He reached over his shoulder. Steel shrieked against leather. He drew his broadsword. The massive blade caught the bleak morning light. He walked toward the iron gates, and the panicked pack scrambled out of his way. "Sovereign, I beg you." The matriarch reached for his boots. "She is just a human." Fenrir spun. He drove the tip of the broadsword directly into the stone courtyard. Sparks exploded. The deafening crack killed the noise in the yard instantly. "She is mine." His voice was a physical blow. "I will not kneel. I will not break. I will not surrender her." He glared down at the matriarch. He would butcher his own pack before a lowlander touched a single hair on Tahlia's head. The silence stretched tight. Then, a soft rustle of fur broke the quiet. Tahlia stepped away from the armory doors. She ignored the trembling matriarch entirely. She walked right past Fenrir and stopped at the barricaded gates.
The iron release lever was freezing. Tahlia wrapped her bare hands around it. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Through the thick oak barricades, she could hear the muffled laughter of the mercenaries outside. She focused on a single quiet memory from an hour ago. A black raven landing on the high rookery just before dawn. A coded tube strapped to its leg. The exact answer she had calculated. She carried the complete destruction of the trade guild right in her pocket. She looked over her shoulder. Fenrir stood anchored in the snow. His broad chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. He was a warlord, ready to die to keep her safe. Tahlia caught his eye. She gave him a small, single smile. A promise of ruin. She turned back to the gates. Dropped the beams. The warlord gave a sharp nod. Wood groaned. The guards stepped forward and hauled the massive oak barricades out of the brackets. Tahlia threw her weight against the iron lever. Gears shrieked. The colossal gates slowly swung open, revealing the massive army waiting outside. Tahlia didn't hesitate. She stepped over the threshold. She walked out into the blood-stained snow, entirely alone. She stopped exactly 10 feet from her uncle's warhorse. The man stared down at her. Arrogant shock painted his face. "You stupid, broken little bird." He laughed. "Did you really think walking out here would save you?" Tahlia reached into her pocket. She pulled out a thick stack of parchment. Heavy bank drafts, stamped with the crimson wax seal of the capital's highest continental bank. "I don't need steel to slaughter you." Her voice was dead calm. She held the parchment up into the freezing wind. "I have liquidated your existence." The midday sun hit 10,000 polished steel blades. Tahlia stood alone in the snow. The colossal iron gates loomed at her back. She gripped the heavy parchment bank drafts until her knuckles turned white. The wind shifted. It carried the stench of unwashed bodies and wet horsehair, the exact smell of her uncle's dark cellars. Her uncle threw his head back. Cruel laughter echoed off the mountain peaks. "What will fragile paper do against cold iron, mutt? Give my vanguard paper cuts?" Tahlia didn't look at him. She locked her eyes on the towering rider just behind his flank. The mercenary commander. "Commander?" She projected her voice over the freezing wind. I hold the official foreclosure of the guild's central bank. The front lines of the massive army shifted. Heavy steel clanked a nervous rhythm. Sellswords bled for gold, and she was holding their pay in her bare hands. Tahlia held the heavy parchment up into the crosswinds. By the authority of the capital bank, your employer's assets were frozen at midnight. The raven flew. The vaults are locked. The laughter died. Her uncle's flushed face turned the color of ash. The commander lowered his spiked mace. "That is a lie!" Her uncle's voice cracked. The commander ignored him. He spurred his massive horse forward, stopping just a few feet from Tahlia. "Ink is easily forged, little bird. I need proof before I turn my steel away from a starving mountain." She had exactly one heartbeat to take the shot.
Fenrir stood in the threshold of the open iron gates. His hand rested heavily on the hilt of his broadsword. The wind carried the scent of her confidence. Surrounded by 10,000 killers, she was the deadliest thing in the snow. Tahlia pulled out the black leather master ledger. She threw it. It hit the frost directly against the commander's boot with a heavy thud. Page 412. The commander didn't move. "Your employer is bankrupt. He lacks the copper to pay your winter wages." A foot soldier stepped forward and grabbed the book from the mud. He scanned the numbers. He leaned up and whispered directly into the commander's ear. A low, dangerous murmur rolled backward through the mercenary ranks. "You are sitting in a freezing valley with 0 rations." Tahlia's voice carried cleanly over the ice. "I legally rerouted your winter supply train to this fortress 3 days ago. Your wagons belong to the mountain." "Lies." Her uncle drew his polished longsword. He kicked his spurs into his horse's flanks and charged directly at her. Fenrir tensed to launch himself forward. The mercenary commander moved faster. He swung his spiked mace in a brutal, horizontal arc. Solid iron smashed into the warhorse's chest. The beast went down instantly. The velvet-clad lord launched over the neck, hitting the freezing mud hard. Tahlia stepped closer to the commander. "I offer double your winter wages, drawn directly from my uncle's seized accounts. Drop your steel and leave this valley. Fight, and you die starving in the snow. Walk, and you walk rich."
The collapse of an empire sounded exactly like heavy iron hitting frozen mud. Tahlia looked down at her uncle. He was rolling miserably in the blood-stained slush. Clang. The commander let go of his massive spiked mace. It sank into the white powder. Clang. Clang. The soldier beside him dropped his broadsword. Then the next. The sound ripped backward through the valley like a wave. 10,000 mercenaries lowered their weapons to the frost. Her brutal math had just bought a bloodless slaughter. "You can't do this." Her uncle scrambled onto his hands and knees. He reached a desperate hand toward the commander. "I am a lord of the guild. Pick up your steel." The commander pulled his destrier around. "You are a broke, fat corpse." The mercenaries spat onto the snow. The vanguard turned their backs, beginning the heavy march out of the freezing valley. Tears cut tracks through the mud on her uncle's face. His trembling fingers wrapped around the hilt of his dropped longsword. Tahlia looked at the man who had locked her in an attic for 10 years. She felt absolutely nothing. She had burned his entire existence to the ground with ink and paper. The roar of the shifting army faded. Soon there was only the rhythmic crunch of retreating boots, the hollow whistle of the mountain wind, and the sound of her uncle gasping for air. "I am the sovereign of this mountain." She didn't yell. The words were meant only for him. She turned her back on the ruined man. She walked slowly toward the colossal iron gates. She stopped in front of the feral warlord waiting in the shadows. "Your prisoner, Alpha."
The valley floor emptied. Only the blood-stained snow and the ruined lord remained. The lowlander scrambled in the freezing mud. His greedy fingers closed around the hilt of his dropped longsword. He had no army. He had no gold. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. A raw scream tore from his throat. He lunged wildly at Tahlia's unprotected back. Fenrir moved. He didn't yell. He simply closed the distance, hitting the lowlander with the brutal force of a falling stone. Expensive steel snapped in half. The broken blade spun uselessly away into the white powder. Fenrir drove the man into the frozen mud. His large hands locked around the thick throat. He didn't hesitate. The penalty for threatening what belonged to the mountain was absolute. A wet, heavy crunch echoed across the valley. The velvet-clad lord went limp. Fenrir let go. He stood up slowly. Hot steam plumed from his heaving chest, and dark blood coated his knuckles. He ignored the dead man at his feet. He ignored the hundreds of warriors watching from the iron gates. He locked his eyes entirely on Tahlia. The harsh, metallic smell of fresh blood hung in the cold air. Mine.
1,000 hardened warriors stood in complete silence. Tahlia kept her ruined shoes planted on the stone. She watched the warlord turn away from the broken corpse. The wind whipped her thin dress, but the heavy pelt on her shoulders held her steady. She looked at the fresh blood dripping from his hands. She felt no fear. The crowd of northern fighters scrambled backward as Fenrir walked across the frost. He stopped mere inches from her. The raw heat radiating off his skin pushed back the freezing mountain air. He reached up. His blood-stained fingers grabbed the heavy iron crown resting in his dark hair. He pulled it off. Then the sovereign of the north dropped heavily onto one knee. His armored kneecap drove straight into the mud. The entire courtyard stopped breathing. The most lethal man in the high peaks had just lowered his scarred head to a human girl. The slur is dead. His voice was a low rumble against the stone. She is no tithe. She is the mind of this mountain. My equal. My queen. A soft rustle of clothing broke the quiet. The silver-haired matriarch took a shaky step forward. Slowly, the proud woman dropped to her knees in the snow. She bowed her head. A massive guard dropped to the mud beside her. Then another. It was a falling wave of steel and submission. Hundreds of scarred warriors lowered their chins to the girl who had saved them with a ledger. Tahlia reached out. Her pale fingertips brushed the blood and frost clinging to Fenrir's jaw. Rise.
The public spectacle of the courtyard eventually melted away. Up in the sovereign's chambers, heavy oak doors sealed out the howling winter storm. A massive stone fireplace roared in the corner. The heat filled the room, casting long shadows across the thick furs piled on the timber bed. Tahlia stood near the thick glass window. She looked down at the mountain she had bought with ink. They actually bowed? Her voice was a soft whisper. Fenrir stepped out of the shadows. He wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her back, pressing her flush against his chest. He buried his face in the warm crook of her neck. They bowed to their savior. His voice was a rough murmur against her skin. I bowed to my obsession. He slowly turned her around to face him. He reached toward the heavy timber nightstand. His scarred hand closed around a solid, freshly bound book. He placed it into her palms. It was a massive, completely blank ledger. The thick spine and heavy pages were bound in solid mountain gold. Tahlia stared down at the book. Write new laws. Fenrir dragged his thumb slowly across her bottom lip. Rewrite the entire continent. I will be the steel that enforces every number. She looked up at him. She was the brilliant, terrifying architect of his future. He didn't wait for an answer. He kissed her. It was hard claiming, an absolute. Tahlia gripped his shoulders. A soft, breathy sound slipped from her throat. She dropped the ledger. Heavy gold slammed onto the timber table. Her hands tangled fiercely in his dark hair. Fenrir hoisted her from the stone floor. He carried his queen toward the shadows of the fur-draped bed. You belong to the mountain now. He whispered the words against her jaw.